It is an association which covers over 1,000 winemaking sites, and this is the first time, well, it's not the first time that you have come here, but it's the first time that we have a comparative study analysing the residual contamination of 18 traditional wines and organic wines in 9 countries, 5 from the EU, and then the other countries include Switzerland and Australia. So we're looking at the traditional wines and the organic wines and making a comparison. And we're trying to see, out of 148 molecules, how many you can find in these wines. And 28 residues have been detected in those 18 wines that were analysed. And there were 8 in particular which have been mentioned in Zerlini's work on pesticides in wine. And this is something that you find in traditional wines and also sometimes in organic wine. So it's very interesting. We've done this because you know that in the glyphosate case we didn't have access to the 74 studies that had been carried out by Busanto. And there were 4 green deputies. It wasn't just the socialists, but we had 4 green members who appealed to the Court of Justice in line with the Darhus Convention and legislation, and they were saying that in line with current studies and access requirements, we should be given access to those studies. And so we were carrying out this study. The Aarhus Convention obliges companies to carry out these studies, and they should not be using business secrets to avoid releasing those studies. So that was a very important ruling. It was from the 7th of March this year, and it will be part of case law. And so we'll be looking at that in connection with the trade secrets. Our job here is to make sure that consumers get information. And this can go through a control body, and it can be provided through transparency in terms of labelling. So that's why I support this initiative, and I support what you have done in your association, because the more information we have, the more we will see the situation improve, especially when it comes to producer level. If you're looking at the traditional sector and you know you'll find pesticides, well, you don't want to be finding unauthorized pesticides. And if you're looking at the organics sector, well, you know, people think it's good, but actually you're finding some residues in the German organic wine which you don't find in the French organic wine.
As you said, we're a citizens collective representing consumers, and we've brought together 1,200 wine producers in 15 member states. And a whole scientific community of doctors, toxicologists, microbiologists, and legal experts. And we want to see more transparency in organic wine. And we want to see a transition towards organic agriculture. In January, Professor and Mrs. Rivasi wanted to carry out this phytosanitary study. It should be an international comparative study on both traditional, conventional and organic wines in order to measure the differences between the two sectors in terms of chemical pesticides and endocrine disruptors. The goal was to see whether the toxins that are classed as mutagenic or carcinogenic and endocrine disruptors were present. So you have CMR and endocrine disruptors, and they do not have to be withdrawn from the market. However, consumers should know what's in the wine when they buy it. That's why we have the organisation TOA to try to bring more transparency to wine and to bring information to the public about endocrine disruptors. And we also have a charter of commitments for cities and regions without endocrine disruptors. In the region and with the professor, as Mrs. Rivasi said, it was a 9-country study. We took 2 samples from each. 1 sample of conventionally produced wine and 1 of organic wine, in order to establish the differences in toxicity between the two sectors. For the EU, the countries studied were France, Italy, Germany, Spain, Greece. We also had Switzerland, that's in Europe, but is not subject to EU legislation. And then United States, Chile, Australia for the 3 non-European countries. And we wanted to emphasize the toxicity which Professor Gilles Lixirani, and this is recognized by the International Agency Regulating Pesticides. These are European and American agencies, regulatory data banks, EFSA, and so on. The professor, well, these are, we looked at internationally recognized molecules, and the amount could be up to 1,000 times in the active molecule. We looked at, for example, arsenic, which is banned in the European Union, has been for 35 years or so, and that's 1,000 times more powerful than the active glyphosate molecules. And we just did that to try to level out the differences in toxicity between the recognized pesticides. But we also know that these are deemed to be inert and are confidential for the companies, the farms producing wines, and so they don't communicate their analyses. What are these molecules doing on the market? They're all authorized, even though they are classified as CMR and or endocrine disruptors. But the Commission has not said that these should be withdrawn from the market, nor has it said that citizens should be informed of their presence in the products they're consuming. If the consumer wants to try to avoid these kind of products, molecules, then they have to have access to information telling them where they are. At the moment, it's impossible to evaluate how safe wine is. You don't know what levels of these substances are in the wine you put on your table and then consume. That's why we need more transparency. We had Patricia Ventilini, Luc Anglas and Jean-François Honnet, and they've said that these molecules do have an impact on endocrine disrupting and CMR. They have to be looked at as a whole, not individually, and this is the cocktail effect that we have to take into account. The toxic impact shouldn't be forgotten, and it means that we have to take all of these parameters into account. So this study shows that conventional wines are, of course, affected by the issues of CMR and endocrine disruptors, but that chemical pesticides do exist in German, Swiss and American organic wines. So it shows that the line between the organic and conventional production can be somewhat blurred. And this is why we really want to sound the alarm bell, because it means that the Commission, the guardian of the treaties, is not being vigilant. It needs to strengthen regulations about organic wine. As Madame Rivasi said, we want to create this positive loop, and this is something that should be encouraged. As you said, we're a citizens' collective representing consumers, and we've brought together 1,200 wine producers in 15 member states, and a whole scientific community of doctors, toxicologists, microbiologists, and legal experts. And we want to see more transparency in organic wine. And we want to see a transition towards organic agriculture. In January, Professor and Mrs. Rivasi wanted to carry out this phytosanitary study. It should be an international comparative study on both traditional, conventional and organic wines in order to measure the differences between the two sectors in terms of chemical pesticides and endocrine disruptors. The goal was to see whether the toxins that are classed as mutagenic or carcinogenic and endocrine disruptors were present. So you have CMR and endocrine disruptors, and they do not have to be withdrawn from the market. However, consumers should know what's in the wine when they buy it. That's why we have the organisation TOA to try to bring more transparency to wine and to bring information to the public about endocrine disruptors. And we also have a charter of commitments for cities and regions without endocrine disruptors.
So where do we get the information from? Well, we got the information from this TOA study, and it shows that in traditional and organic wines, it shows that there are these maximum residual limits, and that there are quite a lot of products that can be found. The levels were not very high, but there were traces, and you could actually have figures up to 20% in connection with the authorised limits. We have the list of wines. We have a few examples, but Olivia will tell you more. So there is a problem here that we're faced with. Firstly, we have a European directive, and it is to a certain extent harmonised when it comes to looking at organic products, and it talks about what can be labelled as organic. But we also want to have labelling covering the residues. So if there isn't any residue labelling, then people don't know exactly what they're getting when they have the organic wine. They don't know if the residues are there or not. And so it's very important. So it's important not only for the organic wines, but it's also for the traditional wines as well, because if I've understood correctly, it is the organic wine that's being checked very carefully, but people don't do the same really with the traditional wines as well. And then there's another point, and this is in connection with the measures. There is wine coming in from Australia and Chile and so on, and it contains the residues, and you find this in both traditional wines and organic wines, and these are pesticides which are not authorised in France. So we do need to have some sort of European control body to check if, when it comes to wine, whether or not there are pesticides in it which are not authorised in Europe, because normally that wine shouldn't even be allowed across the border. And so we really do need a European control body which would be able to do that. And our job here is to make sure that consumers get information.